What happens when someone becomes so confident in their power to make accusations that they never stop to ask whether the system they are manipulating might one day stop working in their favor? In a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything appears orderly on the surface, there is an unspoken rule that everyone learns quickly: avoid conflict, keep your head down, and do not become the subject of attention. For most families, that balance is enough to maintain peace. But for one woman living on the street, peace was never the goal. Control was. And over time, she discovered something unsettlingly effective. Repeated phone calls could turn suspicion into procedure, and procedure into pressure. At first, the calls were small things. Complaints about noise that barely existed. Concerns about movement in neighboring yards that had perfectly normal explanations. Police visits became routine, almost predictable, as if presence itself validated the accusations. And with every response, the imbalance deepened. The neighbors, a quiet black family who had recently moved in, began to feel something shift around them. Not openly hostile confrontation, but something more corrosive: constant observation, constant justification, constant exhaustion from having to prove they belonged in a place where they had done nothing wrong. They tried to stay composed. They tried to avoid escalation. They even began adjusting their behavior, not because they were guilty of anything, but because they were tired of being treated as if they might be. That quiet adaptation slowly created a psychological weight inside the home, where even normal daily actions started to feel like potential accusations waiting to happen. What none of them knew yet was that this pattern was not going unnoticed forever. Because repetition always leaves traces, and systems, even slow ones, eventually start to recognize when behavior stops looking like concern and starts looking like something else entirely. And somewhere within that house, someone was quietly observing everything with a level of understanding that no one on the street expected. If you stay until the end of this story, you will see how a system built to respond without bias can still be forced to confront it, and how one woman's belief in control begins to collapse the moment she realizes who she has actually been calling all along. The first call had felt harmless enough to her. A misunderstanding corrected by authority. But what she did not anticipate was how quickly repetition changes perception. Each additional report added weight, even when the evidence did not. Each response from law enforcement reinforced a sense that her perspective carried more legitimacy than her neighbor's silence. Slowly, without realizing it, she began to treat attention as validation, and validation as permission. Meanwhile, the family next door started documenting everything, not out of aggression, but survival. They were not trying to fight the system, they were trying to understand it. Because when you are repeatedly questioned without cause, you eventually begin to prepare for questions before they are even asked. And as the pattern continued, something subtle began forming in the background, something that would eventually shift the entire direction of everything that followed. Because in situations like this, the most dangerous assumption is believing that the people being targeted have no way to respond. And that assumption was about to become the foundation of everything that came next. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. The first time the police arrived for the third call in a single week, it no longer felt like an isolated response, it felt like a pattern settling into place. The woman who made the call stood on her porch with the calm confidence of someone who believed she was doing the right thing. To her, each visit from law enforcement confirmed what she already believed, that vigilance was responsibility and suspicion was justification. She didn't see repetition as escalation. She saw it as reinforcement. Across the street, the black family watched quietly from behind their front window blinds. They had stopped reacting openly to the visits. Not because it hurt less, but because reacting had never changed the outcome. Instead, they observed, they recorded, they built a silent archive of moments that, individually, looked ordinary, but together were beginning to tell a very different story. The officers who arrived that day were different from the earlier ones. More hesitant, less reactive. One of them asked fewer questions than expected, and instead spent more time looking at the surroundings than listening to the complaint. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it marked the first crack in what had previously been automatic response. Still, procedure was procedure. They spoke to the woman. They checked the property line. They glanced toward the neighboring house. And once again, nothing substantiated the claim. No disturbance, no threat, no wrongdoing. Just the quiet tension of people forced to exist in a space where perception had become more powerful than evidence. But something had changed in how the officers left that day. They didn't leave convinced anymore. They left uncertain. And uncertainty, in systems built on repetition, is the first sign that patterns are being noticed. Inside the Black family's home, the atmosphere was different now. Not panic, but awareness. The kind that forms when you realize that silence is no longer protection, but exposure without control. They were not discussing retaliation. They were discussing documentation. Because experience had taught them something important. When your reality is constantly questioned, proof becomes your only form of stability. Still, beneath that quiet discipline, there was something else present, something they had not yet fully spoken about. One member of the household was not reacting the way the others were. Not because they were detached, but because they were understanding something at a deeper level. Watching patterns not just socially, but structurally. Not just as a neighbor, but as someone who understood how systems interpret behavior when pressure increases over time. And slowly, without announcement, that understanding began to shift the energy around everything. The woman across the street continued making calls, but the responses were no longer identical. The system was beginning to do something it had not done before. It was starting to compare notes. Call logs began stacking. Incident reports began referencing prior visits. Officers began recognizing that what looked like isolated complaints were actually part of a continuous chain. And once a system begins linking repetition, it starts asking questions that were never part of the original report. Why does this keep happening? Why does nothing ever change? Why does the pattern always point in one direction? The confidence that once fueled the woman's actions had not yet disappeared, but it had started to thin at the edges. Small inconsistencies began to surface, delays in police response, slightly more probing questions, the absence of immediate validation. She did not recognize it yet, but she was no longer shaping the system alone. The system was now shaping itself around her behavior. And inside the quiet house across the street, the Black family was no longer just observing the pattern. They were beginning to understand its trajectory. Because patterns do not stay invisible forever. They either dissolve, or they escalate into consequences. And neither outcome was going to be quiet anymore. By the time the seventh call came in, something had clearly changed in how the neighborhood responded. Not outwardly. The street still looked the same. Lawns still trimmed. Curtains still drawn at the same hours. But beneath that surface normalcy, awareness had begun to settle in, subtle, quiet, irreversible. The woman who made the calls still carried the same confidence in her actions, but it was now being met with something new on the other side: hesitation. Not refusal, not confrontation, just hesitation, and that alone was enough to disrupt the rhythm she had grown used to. When the officers arrived this time, they did not move with the same immediate certainty. They asked more detailed questions. They reviewed prior visit notes on handheld devices before speaking. One of them even paused longer than usual at the sidewalk boundary between the two homes, as if measuring not just distance but consistency. Inside the Black family's home, the atmosphere had tightened, but not into fear. Into focus. The repeated visits had stopped feeling random a long time ago. What remained was structure, pattern recognition, documentation that was becoming increasingly organized, increasingly deliberate. They were no longer reacting to each individual incident. They were tracking the sequence as a whole. And that shift mattered, because systems rarely change based on single events. They change when repetition becomes undeniable. What none of the neighbors fully understood yet was that the accumulation of reports was no longer being viewed in isolation. It was being centralized, cross-referenced, compared across time, the kind of process that begins quietly, without public acknowledgement, but carries weight far beyond what any single call represents. And that is where the direction of the situation began to shift in a way no one on the street could see yet. The woman still believed she was managing outcomes. But what she didn't realize was that she had moved from being a source of input to being a subject of analysis. Inside the Black family's home, there was a growing understanding that something larger was forming around these interactions. Not just neighbor conflict, not just repeated police presence, but a structured pattern that institutions eventually recognize when complaints stop appearing random and start appearing habitual. And one member of the household, who had remained unusually quiet through all of this, began to look at the situation differently. Not with anger, not with fear, but with the kind of calm awareness that comes from understanding systems from the inside out. They had not revealed anything yet, but they were no longer just a participant in what was happening. They were beginning to understand how it would eventually be read by the system itself. Because repetition always creates records, and records always create accountability. The woman made her next call with the same language she had used before, but the response she received this time was noticeably different. Slower, more structured, less immediate reassurance, more verification. And that shift, though small on the surface, marked something important. The system was no longer reacting to her. It was evaluating her. And once evaluation begins, belief starts to lose its power. Across the street, the Black family remained still, watching not the outcome of each call anymore, but the direction everything was moving toward. Because now it was no longer about individual incidents. It was about what those incidents were building into. And that structure, once complete, would not depend on opinion. It would depend on evidence. The 10th call did not bring the same response time anymore. That alone changed everything. The woman noticed it first in small ways: longer pauses on the phone, more questions from dispatch, repeated confirmations before officers were even sent out. What had once felt immediate and unquestioned was now layered with friction. But she still believed she was in control of the narrative. She still believed persistence meant authority. What she didn't understand yet was that persistence can also become documentation. Across the street, the Black family had stopped reacting to each visit as separate events. They no longer measured each police arrival by emotion. They measured it by accumulation. Each incident added another line to a record that was slowly becoming too consistent to ignore. They weren't trying to escalate anything. They were simply ensuring that what was happening could not be reduced later into misunderstandings or isolated complaints. Because experience had already taught them that systems are often most dismissive when things look unconnected. But patterns are harder to dismiss. And by now, a pattern was no longer emerging. It was established. Inside local law enforcement channels, something subtle had begun to shift. Officers were starting to recognize the address before arriving. Not officially, not publicly, but informally, through shared awareness, repeated dispatches, and a growing familiarity with the lack of evidence behind each call. And when recognition enters a system like that, interpretation begins to change. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. The woman still made her calls with confidence, but now each interaction included more verification steps. More questions, more hesitation before action. The authority she once felt embedded in the system was starting to feel conditional. And conditional authority is the first sign that influence is weakening. Inside the Black family's home, silence had become intentional. They were no longer trying to prove anything in the moment. They were building something that extended beyond the moment. A structured timeline, a consistent record, a factual chain of events that would hold even when emotion was removed from the situation entirely. One member of the household had begun organizing everything with a level of precision that stood out even within their own family. Dates, times, frequency, patterns of escalation, not because they expected immediate change, but because they understood something fundamental about how accountability is constructed. It does not appear instantly. It accumulates, and then it becomes unavoidable. Meanwhile, across the street, the woman began to experience the first cracks in certainty. Not externally yet, but internally. Small inconsistencies in response, slight shifts in tone from officers, questions that suggested not disbelief but reassessment. She had not yet been challenged directly, but she was no longer being automatically validated, and that difference was beginning to unsettle her more than she would admit. Because confidence built on repetition depends on predictable outcomes, and predictability was now fading. One afternoon call resulted in officers spending significantly longer on the street than before. They spoke quietly among themselves. They referenced prior incidents without being prompted. And when they left, there was no reassurance offered, only neutrality. Not agreement, not denial, just neutrality. And neutrality, in situations built on expectation, feels like rejection without confrontation. Across the street, the Black family noticed this immediately. Not as victory, not as relief, but as transition, because systems do not shift suddenly. They drift. And, once drift begins, direction becomes visible. And what had started as a series of repeated complaints was no longer just a neighborhood issue. It was becoming a structured record of behavior that could no longer be viewed in isolation. And somewhere beyond what either side could see yet, that record was getting closer to being reviewed by someone who would not interpret it as neighborhood conflict, but as something entirely different. Something that would not respond to influence, only to fact. By the time the 13th call was logged, the tone of the situation had changed so significantly that even the woman making the calls could feel it, but not yet understand it. What had once been immediate reassurance had turned into procedural caution. What had once been routine visits had become documented entries with increasing scrutiny attached to them. And what had once felt like unquestioned authority was now slowly being filtered through layers of verification she did not control. She still believed she was reporting a problem. But the system was beginning to ask a different question. Why does the same report keep appearing from the same source? Across the street, the Black family no longer measured incidents by emotional impact. They measured them by escalation curve. Every new call was not just another disruption, it was another data point reinforcing a pattern that was becoming statistically difficult to ignore. And in systems designed around consistency, repetition eventually stops being treated as coincidence. It starts being treated as intent. Inside the neighborhood, something subtle had shifted among other residents as well. People who once ignored the situation entirely were now more aware of it. Not openly involved, not directly engaged, but observant. Watching how often police arrived. Noticing the lack of substantiated findings. Beginning to form their own private conclusions without ever saying them aloud. That silent observation mattered more than anyone realized. Because systems don't only respond to official reports. They respond to collective awareness. Inside law enforcement channels, the pattern was now impossible to overlook at an internal level. Officers who had responded multiple times to the same address began noting inconsistencies between urgency and evidence. The same phrases appeared repeatedly in reports, but the outcomes never escalated beyond standard checks. Over time, the language used internally began to shift from response to recurrence. And recurrence is never neutral. It implies structure. It implies behavior. It implies something ongoing rather than isolated. The Black family noticed something else now too, something more important than the frequency of calls. The questions being asked were changing. No longer just, what is happening? But increasingly, has this happened before? Is there a pattern here? Who is initiating these reports? Those are not questions of reaction. They are questions of evaluation. And evaluation is where systems begin to build accountability. The woman, however, remained anchored in her original belief that persistence reinforced legitimacy. In her mind, repetition was not evidence of escalation. It was evidence of consistency in her perception of threat. But what she did not realize was that perception alone no longer mattered in the same way. Because the system was no longer operating on isolated perception. It was operating on compiled history. And compiled history begins to override individual interpretation once thresholds are reached. Inside the Black family's home, the atmosphere had become steady in a way that did not match the external pressure. There was no panic, no confrontation, only continuity. They had moved from reacting to anticipating the structure of what was happening. One member of the household, who had remained notably reserved through most of the incidents, had begun quietly organizing the timeline in a way that reflected not just events but systemic behavior patterns. The focus was no longer on proving innocence. It was on establishing a complete and undeniable record of repetition. Because at a certain point, truth is not argued. It is demonstrated. And somewhere beyond the neighborhood itself, that demonstration was slowly becoming visible to people who did not rely on assumptions but on verified sequences of behavior. The shift had not yet reached its final stage. But it had clearly passed its initial one. What remained now was escalation through acknowledgement. And once acknowledgement begins, control no longer sits with the person initiating the calls. It moves to the system interpreting them. And that shift, though invisible from the outside, changes everything that follows. By the time the 15th call was made, the response was no longer just slower, it was structured differently. There were more layers now. More verification. More internal flagging before action was taken. And for the first time, the woman making the calls noticed something that unsettled her more than any immediate pushback ever had. She was being asked the same questions repeatedly. Not because she was being ignored, but because her previous reports were now part of the context. What used to be treated as separate incidents had become a continuous file. A developing record. Across the street, the Black family understood this shift without needing anyone to explain it. They had seen enough to recognize when a situation stops being handled as isolated events and starts being treated as a behavioral pattern. And once that shift happens, everything changes. Because individual claims can be dismissed, patterns cannot. Inside law enforcement review channels, the accumulated reports were no longer just being processed, they were being compared. Response logs were being cross-referenced. Dispatch notes were being aligned chronologically. Officers who had previously responded began receiving quiet internal prompts asking them to clarify details from past visits. Not accusations, just verification. But verification is where scrutiny begins. And scrutiny is where narratives start losing control. The neighborhood itself began to feel different, even to those not directly involved. People who had once stayed detached started noticing the frequency of police presence. Conversations that never happened publicly were happening privately now, small observations shared in passing, each one reinforcing the same unspoken conclusion. Something about this pattern didn't add up. The Black family, however, was no longer focused on perception. They were focused on structure. Because structure is what survives once emotion fades. Their documentation had evolved now into a precise timeline, not just of calls, but of escalation behavior. Times, responses, inconsistencies between claims and findings. Every detail recorded with the understanding that clarity only matters when it can be reconstructed later without ambiguity. And slowly, that record began to matter outside the household as well. Not officially yet, but internally. Because systems that rely on procedure eventually reach a point where procedure demands explanation. The woman still believed she was reinforcing order through repetition. In her mind, each call was another confirmation that she was maintaining control over her environment. But what she did not see was how the interpretation of those calls had changed entirely. They were no longer viewed as individual alerts. They were being evaluated as a continuous behavioral pattern originating from a single source. And that distinction is critical. Because once a system identifies a pattern originating from one consistent point, it stops asking only about the target of the reports and begins asking about the reporter. Inside the Black family's home, that shift was felt before it was spoken about. Not as relief, but as recognition that the situation was entering its next phase. The pressure had not disappeared, but it had changed direction slightly. The weight was no longer only on them. It was beginning to distribute itself across the system that had been acting on the information. And somewhere within that system, someone had finally started asking the kind of questions that cannot be ignored once raised. Not whether something had happened, but why it kept happening the same way. And who, exactly, was driving that repetition. Because at this stage, the situation was no longer about one street. It was about what repeated behavior reveals when it is no longer viewed in isolation. And that is where accountability begins to form, not from confrontation, but from recognition that the pattern itself has become the evidence. By the time the 17th call came in, something had fundamentally changed in how the system responded. Not outwardly dramatic, not publicly acknowledged, but internally irreversible. The woman still spoke with the same certainty when she made the report, describing the same type of concerns she had raised before. But this time, there was a noticeable delay before any response was given. Not hesitation in a single officer, but delay across the system itself, as if the report had to pass through something additional before it could even be acted upon. And in a way, it had. Because it was no longer a single complaint. It was a file, a sequence, a pattern that had reached enough repetition to require internal review before action. Across the street, the Black family no longer reacted to each new call at all. Not because they were indifferent, but because they had already moved past the emotional phase of uncertainty. What remained was awareness of structure, an understanding that the situation was now being processed beyond their immediate environment. Their documentation was no longer just personal protection. It had become a complete chronological record of behavior that could be independently verified if ever required. And that level of organization begins to change how institutions interpret situations, even before formal escalation occurs. Inside law enforcement systems, the accumulated reports had now triggered a secondary layer of internal comparison. Officers who had previously responded were being quietly asked to reconcile details from different visits. Small inconsistencies, times, descriptions, lack of substantiated findings, were being aligned side by side. And when inconsistencies repeat across multiple entries, they stop being treated as noise. They become signals. The neighborhood itself had also begun to shift in tone. Not openly, not dramatically, but subtly enough that those involved could feel it. Conversations between neighbors grew more cautious. Observations became more frequent. People who had once ignored the situation entirely were now quietly aware that something repetitive and unresolved was unfolding in their street. And repetition, once noticed, changes perception permanently. The woman, however, still interpreted each response as validation of her concerns. She did not yet recognize that the structure around her had shifted. In her mind, consistency meant credibility. But within the system responding to her, consistency had begun to mean something very different. It meant traceability. It meant pattern origin. It meant scrutiny of source behavior. Inside the Black family's home, the atmosphere remained steady, but not unchanged. There was no panic, no escalation in emotion. Instead, there was a growing understanding that the situation had moved into its most important stage, the point at which systems stop treating events as isolated and begin evaluating them as behavior over time. And that evaluation carries weight far beyond any single incident. Because once behavior is mapped across time, it becomes something that cannot be undone by explanation alone. At that stage, the question is no longer about what was reported. It becomes about why it kept being reported in the same way, by the same person, against the same target, without substantiated outcome. And that question had now officially entered internal consideration. Not publicly, not loudly, but officially enough to change everything that followed. Because when a system begins evaluating repetition instead of reacting to it, the direction of control shifts. And once that shift happens, it does not return to where it was before. By the time internal review notes began circulating quietly within the system, the situation had already crossed an invisible threshold, one that most people on the outside would never notice, but those inside procedural structures recognize immediately. It was no longer about individual calls. It was about escalation integrity. Every report tied to the same source began to be re-examined not for urgency, but for consistency. Officers who had previously responded were now being asked to clarify details that, at the time, had seemed routine. Dates were being aligned, outcomes were being compared, and most importantly, the absence of corroborating evidence was becoming harder to ignore across multiple entries. What once looked like separate interactions was now forming a continuous narrative. And narratives like that change how institutions behave. Across the street, the Black family sensed a shift before it was ever acknowledged openly. The visits from law enforcement had not increased, but the nature of those visits had changed. There was less assumption, more observation. Less immediate reaction, more verification before action. That difference, though subtle, was everything. Because it meant the system was no longer treating the situation as reactive. It was treating it as cumulative. And cumulative data does not remain static, it builds direction. The woman making the calls, however, still believed she was operating within the same framework as before. In her mind, persistence reinforced legitimacy. Each call was, to her, an extension of the previous one, a continuation of concern she believed was justified by her perception of events. But what she failed to realize was that the system no longer viewed those calls as isolated expressions of concern. They were now being grouped, analyzed, and compared as part of a behavioral pattern originating from a single consistent source. And once that classification occurs, interpretation changes entirely. Inside law enforcement review channels, language began to shift subtly. Terms like repeat complainant replaced neutral descriptors. Internal summaries began referencing patterned reporting behavior, not as accusation, but as classification. And classification is the first step toward accountability. The Black family, meanwhile, had moved beyond observation into structured understanding. Their documentation was no longer reactive. It was complete, chronological, and internally consistent. Not emotional records, but factual sequences that could withstand scrutiny from any angle. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. Because systems do not resolve around emotion. They resolve around verifiable structure. As the 15th, 16th, and 17th calls were re-evaluated internally, a broader question began to emerge, one that had not been part of the original response framework at all. At what point does repeated reporting without substantiated outcome become something requiring review of the reporting behavior itself? It was not a public question. Not yet. But it was forming inside the system's own logic. And once systems begin questioning their own inputs, the outcome is no longer controlled by the original source of those inputs. The woman still had confidence in the mechanism she was using, unaware that the mechanism was now applying structure back onto her actions. What once felt like authority was slowly becoming traceability. And traceability, unlike perception, does not depend on belief. It depends on record. Inside the Black family's home, that realization came quietly but clearly. Not as celebration, not as relief, but as understanding that the situation had crossed into its final structural phase. Because once a pattern is recognized at system level, The only thing left is interpretation of consequence. And consequence, once defined by records rather than opinion, cannot be reshaped by repetition. It can only be resolved. By the time the internal review reached its next stage, the tone of the entire situation had changed without a single public announcement. There was no headline yet. No formal statement. No visible shift in the neighborhood. But inside the system, the case file was no longer treated as a series of calls. It had become a consolidated behavioral record. And that changed everything. The 17th report, which had once been processed like the others, was now sitting alongside earlier entries with annotations that did not exist before, cross-references, timestamps aligned for comparison, and notes requesting clarification on repeated patterns originating from the same source. The focus was no longer simply on what was reported. It was on how consistently it was being reported, and under what conditions. Across the street, the Black family had already stopped thinking in terms of individual incidents. They were now operating within the awareness that the system itself had begun restructuring its interpretation of events. What had once required their defense was now undergoing its own evaluation process. And that shift, while invisible externally, is often the most critical stage in any escalation cycle. Because it marks the point where control stops belonging to the initiating voice, and begins transitioning into the reviewing structure. Inside the neighborhood, the atmosphere remained deceptively unchanged. Lawns were still trimmed, cars still parked in familiar places. People still maintained polite distance. But something in the way they observed the street had shifted slightly. Not enough to be spoken aloud, but enough to be felt. Repetition had created awareness, and awareness creates pressure. The woman, however, still operated under the assumption that her actions were reinforcing order. In her mind, each call represented vigilance. Each response from authorities represented validation of concern. She did not perceive the growing gap between her intention and the system's interpretation of her behavior. But that gap was widening. Because within the internal structure now processing her reports, something new had emerged, pattern consistency without external verification. And that is where systems begin to slow down. Not because they are unsure of events, but because they are no longer sure of interpretation. Inside law enforcement channels, officers who had responded multiple times began to notice that their reports were being revisited without prompting. Small inconsistencies, previously irrelevant, were now being grouped. The absence of corroborating evidence was no longer being treated as normal variance. It was being tracked, and tracking creates momentum. The Black family felt this shift not through direct interaction, but through absence of escalation. Fewer assumptions, more questions, longer pauses before conclusions were drawn. The system was no longer reacting in real time to claims, it was validating them against history before responding. And history, once compiled, begins to override immediacy. One evening, as the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, the internal tone of the situation shifted again. A new layer of review was initiated, not triggered by emotion or complaint, but by accumulated inconsistency across multiple reports tied to the same origin point. It was not labeled as wrongdoing. Not yet. It was labeled as behavioral reporting pattern requiring further assessment. But labels are less important than direction. And the direction was now clear. What had begun as isolated calls had evolved into a structured file of repeated behavior under evaluation. And in systems governed by procedure, evaluation always leads to one thing: clarification. And once clarification begins, assumptions stop carrying weight. Only verified structure remains. Inside the Black family's home, that realization settled quietly, not as triumph, but as confirmation that the system itself had begun reaching the same conclusion they had understood much earlier. Repetition is not neutral. It is evidence of direction. And direction, once established, cannot remain unresolved indefinitely. By the time further assessment was formally logged into the internal system, the situation had entered its most sensitive phase, where perception and procedure begin to separate. On the surface, nothing had changed. The neighborhood still functioned normally. Morning routines continued. Cars left for work. Curtains opened and closed on schedule. To any outside observer, it would still look like a quiet suburban disagreement that had simply attracted more attention than usual. But internally, the structure had shifted entirely. The case file was no longer a collection of reports. It was a behavioral timeline under review. And once a timeline reaches that stage, every entry begins to matter differently. Across the street, the Black family no longer measured the situation by frequency of police visits. Those had already become secondary. What mattered now was the nature of the questions being asked during those visits, and more importantly, what was no longer being assumed. Officers were no longer arriving with immediate conclusions. They were arriving with context. They referenced prior entries before engaging. They asked for clarification rather than confirmation. And in doing so, they revealed something important. The system was no longer reacting. It was validating. And validation requires comparison. The woman, however, still operated from the belief that consistency in reporting equaled credibility. In her framework, repetition was not suspicious, it was reinforcement. Each call she made still felt justified to her, as though persistence itself was proof of legitimacy. But within the system evaluating her behavior, repetition without external validation had begun to take on a different meaning. It was now being mapped, tracked, compared against outcome. And when input remains constant while outcome does not align, systems do something inevitable. They begin examining the input source. Inside internal review discussions, language shifted subtly again. Not in public statements, but in operational notes. Descriptions moved from reported incidents to patterned reports. Time gaps between calls were analyzed. Geographic consistency was noted. The absence of escalating evidence became part of the discussion itself. And slowly, a new question formed within the structure. Was this a series of unrelated concerns, or a single behavioral pattern being repeatedly expressed? That question, once asked, does not disappear. It expands. Across the street, the Black family had already reached the stage where emotional reaction was no longer part of their process. They were no longer waiting for validation from external authority. Instead, they were observing how that authority was now independently reconstructing the situation from accumulated data. And that reconstruction was beginning to resemble something very different from how it started. Not a neighborhood dispute, not isolated concerns, but a structured pattern requiring interpretation. One evening, as the street grew quiet again, the system reached a point where the accumulated reports could no longer be processed independently. They were now being reviewed collectively, with emphasis on origin consistency and behavioral repetition. And in that collective view, something became unavoidable. The source of the reports was no longer neutral in the analysis. It had become part of the analysis. The woman still believed she was reporting reality as she perceived it. But perception, once documented repeatedly without external corroboration, begins to lose its weight inside structured systems. What replaces it is not judgment. It is classification. And classification always leads to escalation in review status. Inside the Black family's home, there was no celebration, no confrontation, no emotional reaction to this development. Only recognition that the system had now reached the same conclusion that pattern-based analysis always produces when sufficient repetition exists without independent verification. And that conclusion is simple. When reports stop being isolated and start forming a chain, the chain itself becomes the subject of investigation. And once that happens, the direction of the situation no longer depends on who made the first call. It depends on what the record reveals over time. By the time the review process entered its consolidated phase, the situation had quietly moved beyond the boundaries of a neighborhood matter. Nothing had been announced publicly. Nothing had escalated in visible, dramatic fashion. But within the structure of the system handling the reports, something irreversible had already happened. The narrative was no longer controlled by individual calls. It was controlled by the pattern those calls created. Each entry, once treated as separate, was now part of a continuous file being interpreted as behavior over time. And when behavior becomes the focus, intent becomes secondary to structure. Across the street, the Black family no longer waited for anything to happen, in the traditional sense. The waiting phase had already passed. What remained was observation of how institutional interpretation continued to evolve when presented with sustained repetition without external confirmation. And that evolution was now clearly visible in procedural language. Reports were being referenced collectively. Prior visits were cited during new responses. Officers arriving on scene were briefed with context rather than isolated summaries. The system had begun to treat the situation as ongoing rather than intermittent. And that shift carries weight. Because once something is treated as ongoing, it is no longer evaluated moment by moment. It is evaluated as a whole. The woman, still confident in her perception, continued to believe she was reinforcing order through consistency. To her, every call was still an isolated act of concern. But what she did not see was that isolation had already disappeared from the system's interpretation. Each new report was now being added to a chain that had already been structurally recognized. And chains do something systems cannot ignore. They reveal origin. Inside the internal review layer, analysts were no longer focusing on whether any single report had merit. Instead, they were focusing on why similar reports continued to originate from the same source despite repeated lack of corroboration. That question shifted the entire tone of evaluation. Because systems are designed to respond to incidents. But they are also designed to detect patterns that defy incident-based explanation. And when those patterns persist, attention turns inward, not toward the target of reports but toward the behavior generating them. Across the street, the Black family remained steady, but increasingly aware that the situation had moved into a phase where their role was no longer reactive. It was observational in a broader sense, watching how structured systems reclassify information once repetition crosses internal thresholds. And those thresholds had now been crossed. The file was no longer simply being updated. It was being interpreted. And interpretation introduces consequence. Not immediately. Not visibly. But structurally. The woman still believed she was shaping outcomes through persistence, unaware that persistence had already been redefined inside the system as behavioral consistency requiring review. And once behavior is reviewed as a pattern rather than a response, it stops being seen as isolated judgment calls. It becomes evidence of process. And process always leads to accountability pathways. One evening, as the neighborhood remained quiet under routine dusk, the internal system finalized another layer of classification. The repeated reports were now officially grouped under a single behavioral origin category for further administrative assessment. No conclusions were announced. No external statements were made. But within the system, something had fundamentally changed. The situation was no longer about individual complaints. It was about the pattern of complaints themselves. And once that shift occurs, the original meaning of each call is no longer what determines the outcome. What determines the outcome is the structure those calls have created over time. And that structure, once fully formed, cannot remain unexamined indefinitely. By the time the internal classification had fully stabilized, the situation had reached a point where nothing about it could be interpreted in isolation anymore. Every report, every response, every absence of corroboration had been folded into a single structured timeline. And that timeline now carried a weight that individual incidents could never carry on their own. Because systems do not remember moments. They remember sequences. Across the street, the Black family had reached a quiet understanding of that reality. There was no longer any confusion about what was happening around them. The uncertainty phase had ended earlier, replaced by something more defined: recognition that the system itself was now processing behavior over time rather than reacting to single events. And that recognition changed their posture entirely. They were no longer waiting for intervention. They were observing the transition from reaction to review. Inside law enforcement structures, the language had shifted again. What once would have been described as calls for service were now being referenced as recurring reports from a single origin point. That phrasing mattered more than it appeared to on the surface, because it removes emotional framing and replaces it with structure. And structure is what leads to formal evaluation. The woman, still convinced she was maintaining vigilance, continued her pattern of reporting. But now each interaction carried a different tone from the system responding to her. Not hostility, not agreement, just increasing procedural depth, more confirmation steps, more internal cross-checking before action. And that subtle shift created something she did not fully recognize yet: distance. The system was no longer immediately aligning with her perspective. It was comparing her perspective against accumulated data. Across the street, the Black family could feel that distance forming in real time. The visits had not escalated in volume, but they had changed in nature. Officers were now visibly referencing prior history. Questions were more specific. Responses were less automatic. And when a system stops being automatic, it stops being reactive. It becomes analytical. Inside internal review discussions, the accumulated record had now reached a stage where analysts were focusing less on the content of each report and more on the structural consistency of reporting behavior itself. Not whether something had occurred once, but why similar reports continued to originate repeatedly under unchanged conditions. And that is where systems begin to shift perspective. Because at that point, the subject of evaluation is no longer the reported event. It becomes the reporting pattern. And once that transition happens, interpretation begins to move toward origin analysis rather than incident response. The Black family understood, in their own quiet way, that the situation had now entered its final structural phase. Not resolution yet, but the stage where systems begin aligning information in preparation for conclusion. And conclusions, when formed from structured repetition, were rarely influenced by individual intent. They are influenced by accumulated consistency. The woman still believed she was shaping the narrative through persistence. But persistence, when stripped of validation, becomes something else entirely inside structured systems. It becomes data. And data, once complete enough, stops asking what someone believed. It starts asking what their behavior demonstrates over time. And that question, once fully formed, cannot remain unanswered indefinitely. Because once a system begins interpreting behavior as pattern rather than isolated action, the direction of the outcome is no longer uncertain. It is only a matter of when it is formally recognized. By the time the system moved from internal review into structured evaluation, the situation had crossed into its most decisive phase, where interpretation is no longer informal, and classification begins to carry administrative weight. Nothing outwardly dramatic changed in the neighborhood. There were no visible announcements. No sudden disruptions. Life on the surface continued in its usual rhythm. But beneath that surface, the file had changed status. What had once been a collection of repeated reports was now being treated as a consolidated behavioral case for assessment. And that shift is not procedural detail, it is structural escalation. Across the street, the Black family no longer interpreted events in real time. They were now watching a process unfold that had already moved beyond immediate reaction. The visits from law enforcement had become less about responding to calls and more about contextual verification against an existing record. And that difference marked a clear boundary. This was no longer about isolated complaints. It was about continuity of behavior. Inside the system, analysts were no longer asking whether individual reports were valid. That question had already been answered indirectly through repetition and lack of corroborating escalation outcomes. Instead, the focus had shifted to something more fundamental. Why a single source continued producing a sustained sequence of similar reports without corresponding external confirmation. That question changes everything, because it reframes the subject from what is being reported to why the reporting pattern exists. And once that shift occurs, the center of evaluation moves away from the target of the reports entirely. It moves toward the origin of the reporting behavior. The woman, still confident in her interpretation of events, continued her pattern unchanged. But she began noticing something she could not easily explain: increased verification steps, more detailed questioning, less immediate alignment from responding officers. What had once felt like certainty in response was becoming conditional. And conditional response is the first visible sign that a system is no longer operating on assumption. It is operating on accumulated review. Across the street, the Black family observed this change with complete awareness of what it represented. There was no emotional escalation, no surprise, only recognition that the process had now reached the stage where systems begin reconciling long-term data with operational response behavior. And reconciliation always introduces one thing: redefinition. Because once behavior is redefined as a pattern, individual interpretation loses authority. Inside internal channels, the consolidated file had now been marked for elevated review due to persistent repetition without escalation-aligned outcomes. Officers who had previously engaged with the situation were being asked to confirm consistency across reports. Small discrepancies that had once been ignored were now being logged as relevant variables. And those variables matter more than they appear to. Because systems do not rely on single contradictions. They rely on accumulated alignment or misalignment across time. And when misalignment becomes consistent, it becomes evidence of systemic pattern rather than isolated error. The woman still believed she was reinforcing structure through persistence. But within the system evaluating her actions, persistence had been reclassified. It was no longer viewed as separate acts of concern. It was being evaluated as continuous behavioral input from a single origin point. And that classification is decisive. Because once input is defined as continuous, output no longer responds to each instance independently. It responds to the entire sequence. And that sequence, now fully compiled, was approaching the stage where interpretation could no longer remain internal. It had to move toward resolution. Not because of emotion, but because structured systems cannot indefinitely maintain unresolved patterns once they reach full visibility within review frameworks. And what had started as repeated calls on a quiet street was now approaching the point where the system itself would have to define what those repetitions actually meant. By the time the case moved into its highest internal review tier, the structure of the entire situation had fundamentally changed. What had once been treated as recurring neighborhood complaints was now being analyzed as a complete behavioral sequence, one that could no longer be separated into individual entries without losing meaning. And that is the moment systems begin to stabilize their interpretation. Across the street, the Black family no longer viewed the situation as unfolding in real time. Instead, they understood it as something already being processed at a level beyond their immediate control or influence. The visible events, the calls, the visits, the questions, were now just surface expressions of a deeper procedural evaluation already in motion. And that evaluation had reached a point of consolidation. Inside the system, analysts were no longer focusing on single reports or isolated responses. Instead, they were reviewing the full trajectory of behavior over time. The consistency of origin, the repetition of claims without escalating corroboration, the alignment, or lack of alignment, between reported concerns and observable outcomes. And in structured systems, that comparison is decisive. Because once behavior is mapped over time, interpretation no longer depends on individual belief. It depends on pattern integrity. The woman, still operating from her original mindset, had not adjusted her perception of what was happening. To her, each call remained an independent act of concern. Each response from authorities still felt like validation that her vigilance was justified. But what she could not see was that her behavior was no longer being interpreted as isolated judgment calls. It was being interpreted as a continuous reporting pattern originating from a single source. And that distinction is critical. Because systems do not evaluate intent in isolation when repetition exists. They evaluate consistency of behavior against outcomes. Across the street, the Black family could feel the shift not through direct confrontation, but through procedural tone changes during interactions. Officers were asking fewer assumption-based questions and more clarification-based ones. Prior reports were referenced without prompting. The framework of engagement had changed from reactive to confirmatory. And confirmatory systems do something important. They begin validating structure instead of reacting to input. Inside internal review channels, the accumulated file had now reached a stage where it was no longer just being assessed, it was being synthesized. Individual entries were being grouped into a single behavioral profile for analysis. The focus was no longer on what was reported at each moment, but on what the entire sequence demonstrated over time. And that is where systems begin to move toward resolution. Because once a behavioral profile is formed, it becomes the primary reference point for all future interpretation. The Black family remained steady through this phase, not because the pressure had disappeared, but because its nature had changed. It was no longer unpredictable. It was structured, and structured pressure is easier to understand, even if it is not yet resolved. One evening, as the neighborhood remained quiet under routine stillness, the internal system reached a final preparatory stage. The file was now marked for comprehensive assessment due to sustained repetition of reporting behavior from a single origin without corresponding escalation evidence. No conclusions were publicly stated. No outcomes were announced. But within the system, the direction had already been set. Because once behavior is consolidated into a pattern profile, interpretation stops being fragmented. It becomes holistic. And once interpretation becomes holistic, the system no longer evaluates individual actions. It evaluates what those actions represent collectively. And at that level, nothing remains invisible for long. Because patterns, once fully recognized, always demand resolution, not through reaction, but through structured understanding of what they ultimately indicate. By the time the consolidated behavioral profile entered its final review phase, the entire case had reached a level of clarity that no longer depended on individual reports to be understood. Everything had already been accounted for. Every call, every response, every absence of supporting evidence. All of it had been arranged into a single continuous structure that now carried more meaning than any isolated incident ever could. And in structured systems, meaning is what drives outcome. Across the street, the Black family no longer interpreted the situation as something happening to them moment by moment. Instead, they understood it as a process that had already reached its internal conclusion phase. What remained visible externally was simply the final layers of that process unfolding in real time. And those layers were becoming increasingly procedural. The tone of law enforcement interaction had shifted noticeably. Officers no longer approached the situation with assumption or immediate validation. Instead, they referenced internal notes before engaging. They asked questions designed not to confirm claims, but to verify consistency across the established record. That shift, while subtle, is significant, because it signals that the system is no longer reacting to input. It is reconciling input against a compiled behavioral profile. Inside internal review channels, the pattern had now been formally acknowledged as consistent reporting behavior originating from a single source over a sustained period, without corresponding escalation or external verification aligning with repeated claims. And once that classification is made, the focus of analysis inevitably shifts. It no longer centers on the reported subjects. It centers on the reporting pattern itself. The woman, still unaware of the full structural shift underway, continued to operate under her original assumption that repetition reinforced credibility. To her, each call remained an individual act of concern. Each interaction with authorities still felt like a confirmation that her perspective was being heard. But within the system, hearing and validating are no longer the same thing once patterns are established. Because hearing is immediate, validation is cumulative, and accumulation changes interpretation. Across the street, the Black family remained composed, but fully aware that the situation had entered its final structural stage. There was no longer uncertainty about direction, only observation of how that direction was being formalized internally. The emotional weight of earlier phases had given way to something more defined, understanding that systems do not resolve on impulse. They resolve when the structure of accumulated data becomes too consistent to interpret in multiple ways. And that point had now been reached. Inside the system, the final review summary was being prepared. Not as accusation, not as conclusion in emotional terms, but as structured interpretation of behavioral repetition over time. And that summary centered on one unavoidable reality. A sustained pattern of repeated reporting originating from a single source without corresponding escalation evidence supporting the repeated claims. That structure does not remain ambiguous for long. Because once patterns are fully documented, systems are designed to do one thing: resolve ambiguity into classification. And classification is the final step before formal determination. The neighborhood itself remained outwardly unchanged, but the meaning of everything within it had already shifted. What once appeared as isolated calls had become a continuous behavioral record. What once seemed like routine responses had become part of a structured evaluation process. And what once felt like control had already transitioned into review. Because at this stage, nothing is interpreted as separate anymore. Everything is connected. And once everything is connected, the system no longer asks what happened. It asks what the entire sequence demonstrates. And that question, once fully formed, does not remain unanswered for long. By the time the final structured assessment was prepared, the system was no longer dealing with ambiguity, it was dealing with interpretation that had already narrowed itself through repetition. Everything had been reduced to a single coherent trajectory. Not because anyone forced it to be, but because the data itself refused to support multiple explanations anymore. Across the street, the Black family no longer treated each interaction as an isolated event. The visits from law enforcement had become predictable in timing and increasingly procedural in tone. Officers referenced prior entries before asking questions. Nothing was treated as new without first being compared against what had already been recorded. And that comparison changed everything about how the situation functioned. Because once a system begins referencing history before responding to present input, the present loses its independence. It becomes part of continuity. Inside internal review channels, analysts had now compiled the full sequence into a single behavioral profile. The focus was no longer on individual reports or momentary interactions. It was on sustained repetition originating from a consistent source over time, without corresponding escalation or external validation aligning with repeated claims. And that is where systems begin to transition from observation to conclusion preparation. Not because emotion is involved, but because structure demands resolution once it becomes complete enough to interpret without contradiction. The woman, still confident in her perception of events, had not yet recognized the structural shift fully underway. To her, each call remained an independent expression of concern. Each response from authorities still felt like validation that her vigilance was justified. But what she could not see was that validation had already changed its form. It was no longer immediate. It was no longer reactive. It was now conditional on accumulated consistency across time. And conditional validation is not reinforcement. It is evaluation. Across the street, the Black family could feel the system stabilizing into its final interpretive phase. There was no escalation in emotional intensity anymore, only clarity of direction. The uncertainty that defined earlier stages had been replaced by structured understanding of how the system itself was now processing the situation. And that processing was no longer fragmented. It was unified. Inside internal review documentation, the case was now being summarized under a consolidated behavioral pattern category. The language used was careful, procedural, and neutral in tone, but the implication was unmistakable. Repeated reporting behavior from a single origin point over a sustained period without corresponding escalation evidence. That phrase, in structured systems, is not incidental. It is defining. Because once behavior is defined at that level, interpretation is no longer open-ended. It becomes directional. And direction always leads to procedural outcome. The Black family remained composed through this phase, not because the situation had become easier, but because it had become legible in a way it wasn't before. What had once felt chaotic now had structure. What had once felt unpredictable now followed a traceable logic. And traceable logic is what systems rely on when moving toward resolution. One evening, as the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, the internal system finalized its last pre-resolution classification step. The accumulated reports were no longer treated as separate claims. They were now formally recognized as a continuous behavioral sequence requiring structured interpretation. No public action had been taken yet. No external statement had been made. But internally, the situation had already crossed its final threshold. Because once behavior is consolidated into a single interpretable pattern, the system no longer evaluates each input separately. It evaluates the entire sequence as one complete structure. And once that happens, the only remaining step is determination of what that structure represents in formal terms. Not speculation, not assumption, but classification based on fully compiled evidence over time. And that is where resolution begins to take shape, not in sudden change, but in the moment structure becomes too complete to ignore. By the time the system entered its final determination phase, the entire structure of the case had already stabilized into something that no longer required reinterpretation, not emotionally, not socially, but procedurally. Every report had been logged, aligned, and compared against its corresponding response history. Every absence of evidence had been accounted for. Every repetition had been mapped across time, forming a continuous behavioral sequence that could no longer be broken into isolated parts without losing meaning. And in structured systems, completeness is the point where evaluation ends and classification begins. Across the street, the Black family no longer experienced the situation as unfolding chaos. It had become something closer to procedural observation. The rhythm of external interaction had slowed, replaced by more careful verification before response, more reliance on recorded history, and less assumption in real-time interpretation. And that change reflected something fundamental. The system was no longer reacting to events. It was validating against record. Inside internal review channels, the consolidated behavioral profile had now reached final assessment status. The focus was no longer on whether individual reports held merit. That question had already been absorbed into the larger structure of accumulated outcomes. Instead, the focus was entirely on consistency. Consistency of reporting. Consistency of absence of escalation outcomes aligned with repeated claims. Consistency of origin source across a sustained timeline. And when consistency is evaluated across all variables simultaneously, interpretation becomes singular rather than plural. Because systems do not tolerate indefinite ambiguity once full data alignment is achieved. The woman, still operating from her original perspective, did not perceive this transition. To her, each interaction remained independent. Each call remained an act of vigilance. Each response remained confirmation that she was being heard. But what she did not see was that being heard is not the same as being validated once systems begin compiling behavior over time. Inside the structure evaluating her reports, the interpretation had already shifted from event-based analysis to origin-based assessment. The question was no longer about individual incidents. It was about the pattern of reporting itself. And once that becomes the focus, intent is no longer the primary variable. Structure is. Across the street, the Black family remained steady, fully aware that the system had now entered its final interpretive stage. The tension of uncertainty had been replaced by recognition of procedural direction. What remained visible externally was simply the final alignment of internal classification. No escalation had occurred publicly. No announcement had been made. But within the system, everything necessary for resolution had already been assembled. The final assessment summary reflected a consolidated behavioral sequence, originating from a single source, sustained over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes validating repeated claims. And once that structure is finalized, systems do not continue analyzing indefinitely. They move toward formal interpretation. Because unresolved patterns are not permitted to remain open-ended once they reach full structural clarity. And that is where the shift becomes irreversible. Not through reaction, not through confrontation, but through the moment a pattern becomes fully defined within the system that was processing it all along. Because once definition occurs at that level, the outcome is no longer uncertain. It is only waiting to be formally acknowledged. By the time formal acknowledgement was prepared internally, the situation had already moved beyond the point where additional data could change its direction. The structure was complete. And in structured systems, completeness is what triggers final interpretation, not further escalation. Across the street, the Black family no longer measured time in individual incidents. The pattern had already resolved itself into a predictable rhythm of procedural response. What remained now was not uncertainty, but confirmation of how the system itself was choosing to categorize what had occurred over time. And that categorization was no longer fragmented. It was unified. Inside internal channels, the consolidated behavioral profile had reached its final review layer. The language of the assessment remained formal and neutral, but its structure reflected something decisive. A sustained sequence of repeated reporting originating from a single source over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes that aligned with repeated claims. That structure, once fully confirmed across records, leaves very little interpretive space. Because systems do not rely on belief. They rely on consistency across data. And when consistency is one-sided, interpretation narrows until only one explanation remains structurally viable. The woman, still unaware of how fully the system had transitioned from response to evaluation, continued to believe she was engaging in isolated acts of reporting. Each call still felt to her like a separate decision based on immediate perception. But within the system processing those calls, separation no longer existed. Every entry was now part of a continuous timeline. And timelines, once complete, do not allow isolated interpretation without distortion. Across the street, the Black family observed the final stage of this shift not through any dramatic external event, but through procedural tone changes that were now unmistakable. The questions asked during interactions were no longer exploratory. They were confirmatory. Prior records were referenced directly. Clarifications were requested against documented history rather than immediate perception. And that change signals something very specific in structured environments. The system is reconciling itself with accumulated evidence. Inside review documentation, the case had now been formally prepared for final classification. Not as a collection of incidents. Not as a series of misunderstandings or isolated reports. But as a single behavioral sequence evaluated across time. And once a sequence is fully defined, interpretation stops being flexible. It becomes fixed. Because fixed interpretation is necessary for procedural closure. The Black family remained composed through this phase, fully aware that the system had now reached the point where its own internal logic would guide the outcome forward without requiring additional input. The emotional weight of earlier stages had been replaced by structural clarity. And structural clarity removes unpredictability. 1. Evening, as the neighborhood remained still under its usual quiet, the system reached its final internal state before formal acknowledgement. All relevant data had been aligned. All inconsistencies accounted for. All repetitions consolidated into a singular interpretive framework. And at that point, the question was no longer what had happened. It was how the pattern should be formally understood. Because once a behavioral sequence reaches full consolidation, systems do not continue to debate interpretation indefinitely. They assign classification. And classification is the final step before closure. Not emotional closure. Not narrative closure. But procedural closure based on complete behavioral structure. And what had begun as repeated calls on a quiet street had now become something the system itself could no longer treat as separate moments in time. Because once behavior is fully compiled into a single interpretable pattern, the system no longer sees individual actions. It sees only what the pattern represents as a whole. And that is where resolution begins to take form, quietly, structurally, and without deviation from the record that created it. By the time the case reached its final procedural threshold, everything that needed to be analyzed had already been fully absorbed into the system's record. There were no missing pieces left to investigate. No unresolved contradictions left to reconcile. Only a complete behavioral timeline that had been reviewed, cross-referenced, and internally validated across multiple layers of assessment. And once that level of completion is reached, systems stop treating input as isolated events. They begin treating it as defined structure. Across the street, the Black family no longer experienced the situation as unpredictable. It had entered a phase where outcomes were no longer shaped by immediate reactions, but by accumulated procedural understanding. Each interaction with authorities reflected that shift: less assumption, more verification; less immediate acceptance, more structured reference to prior history. And that evolution in response is never accidental. It is the visible edge of internal classification. Inside the system, the consolidated behavioral profile had now been finalized for formal interpretation. The language used in the internal documentation remained precise and neutral, but its meaning carried weight that could no longer be divided into separate incidents. It described a sustained sequence of repeated reports originating from a single source over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes that aligned with repeated claims. And when that structure is fully established, systems no longer evaluate individual inputs independently. They evaluate the integrity of the entire sequence. Because integrity determines classification, the woman, still operating under the assumption that each call existed in isolation, did not perceive the structural shift that had already taken place. To her, persistence still meant credibility. Each report still felt like a separate, justified response to perceived concerns. But within the system processing her behavior, separation no longer existed. Everything had been unified into a single continuous record. And continuity changes interpretation completely. Across the street, the Black family understood this stage clearly now. There was no longer emotional uncertainty surrounding what was happening. What remained was recognition of procedural progression, understanding that the system had moved past reaction and was now operating within evaluation logic that depends on accumulated consistency. And once evaluation logic stabilizes, outcomes become increasingly defined by structure rather than perception. Inside internal channels, the case had now reached its final interpretive stage before closure. All relevant data had been aligned. All repeated entries had been grouped. All inconsistencies had been accounted for within the broader timeline. And at that point, systems do something very specific. They prepare classification, not as speculation, not as interpretation in progress, but as formal definition based on fully consolidated behavior over time. The neighborhood itself remained visually unchanged, but its informational meaning had already shifted completely. What once appeared as isolated reports had become a structured behavioral pattern. What once looked like routine responses had become part of a continuous evaluation process. And what once felt like control through repetition had already transitioned into observation under review. Because once a pattern is fully recognized within structured systems, it no longer exists as separate actions in time. It exists as a single entity. And that entity, once defined, does not remain open-ended indefinitely. It moves toward formal conclusion, not through escalation, but through completion of interpretation. And once interpretation is complete, the system no longer asks what happened. It finalizes what it means. By the time the final internal classification draft was prepared, the system had already moved past interpretation into structured resolution planning. Not public resolution, not visible action, but procedural closure. Across the street, the Black family no longer interpreted each new interaction as part of an uncertain chain of events. The chain itself had already been fully recognized within the system reviewing it. What remained externally was simply the slow alignment of procedure with completed analysis. And that alignment always takes time. Inside the system, the consolidated behavioral profile had reached its definitive stage. Every report, every response, every documented absence of corroborating escalation had already been integrated into a single continuous framework. And that framework no longer required additional input. It required formal categorization, because in structured environments, once a behavioral sequence is fully compiled, the purpose of review is no longer discovery. It is definition. The language used in the internal summary remained precise, controlled, and procedural. It described repeated reporting behavior originating from a single source over a sustained period, without corresponding escalation outcomes that validated the repeated claims in a consistent manner. And when a structure like that is finalized, interpretation narrows to a single remaining function: determining what category the behavior belongs to. The woman, still unaware of the full depth of the internal transition, continued to operate under her original framework of understanding. Each call remained, in her mind, a separate action tied to immediate perception. Each response she received still felt like confirmation that her concerns were being acknowledged. But within the system processing those actions, the distinction between individual calls no longer existed. Everything had been merged into one continuous behavioral record. And once that happens, perception loses its independent influence. Across the street, the Black family understood the shift not as a sudden change, but as the final stage of a process that had been unfolding step by step from the beginning. There was no longer uncertainty about direction, only recognition that the system had reached the point where its internal logic would now carry the situation forward without further ambiguity. And systems, once they reach that point, do not revert. They complete. Inside internal channels, the case was now labeled for final procedural determination. Not as a series of incidents, not as a collection of misunderstandings, but as a unified behavioral sequence requiring formal classification based on accumulated structure over time. And that classification step is always decisive, because once behavior is defined at that level, it is no longer open to reinterpretation based on individual perspective. It becomes fixed within the system's operational understanding. The neighborhood itself remained outwardly unchanged, but the meaning of everything within it had already been redefined. What once appeared as repeated complaints had become a structured behavioral pattern. What once felt like routine responses had become part of a continuous evaluation framework. And what once felt like control through repetition had already transformed into a fully documented record under review. Because once systems complete full structural analysis, they no longer engage with isolated events. They engage with what those events collectively represent. And once that representation is clear, closure is no longer a possibility. It becomes a procedural necessity. By the time the procedural necessity for closure was formally acknowledged within the system, the entire case had already reached its natural endpoint in all meaningful structural terms. Nothing new needed to be discovered. Nothing further needed to be validated. Everything that could be observed had already been observed, recorded, aligned, and reviewed across time. And once that level of completion is achieved, systems no longer operate in uncertainty. They operate in classification. Across the street, the Black family no longer viewed the situation as something unfolding unpredictably. It had become something that moved along a defined internal path, one that no longer depended on individual reactions, but on how the compiled record was being interpreted within institutional structure. And that interpretation was now finalizing its form. Inside the system, the consolidated behavioral profile had reached its definitive classification stage. The language remained formal, precise, and neutral, but the meaning behind it was no longer ambiguous. It described a sustained sequence of repeated reporting behavior originating from a single source over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes that consistently validated the repeated claims through independent verification. And once that structure is fully established, systems no longer debate interpretation. They assign definition. The woman, still unaware of how completely the system had transitioned from reactive processing to structured evaluation, continued to believe her actions existed as isolated expressions of concern. In her framework, each call still held independent meaning. Each report still felt like a justified response to perceived issues in real time. But within the system processing those actions, independence no longer existed. Every entry had already been absorbed into a single continuous behavioral record. And continuity changes everything about interpretation. Because systems do not respond to perception. They respond to accumulated structure over time. Across the street, the Black family now understood the final stage clearly. There was no longer uncertainty about whether the system would reach a conclusion. That point had already passed. What remained was procedural completion, the translation of a fully compiled behavioral record into formal classification. And once classification begins, interpretation stops evolving. It stabilizes. Inside internal channels, the case was now undergoing final confirmation review. All entries had been aligned chronologically. All repeated patterns had been verified across multiple response cycles. All inconsistencies had been contextualized within the broader timeline. And at that stage, systems do something inevitable. They finalize meaning, not through speculation, not through escalation, but through structured interpretation of fully completed behavioral data. The neighborhood itself remained visually unchanged, but its informational structure had already transformed completely. What once appeared as isolated incidents had become a unified behavioral sequence. What once seemed like routine responses had become part of a continuous evaluation system. And what once felt like control through repetition had already been fully redefined as a documented pattern under formal review. Because once systems complete full behavioral consolidation, they no longer separate events into individual moments. They interpret them as one complete structure. And once that structure is fully defined, the system no longer asks what occurred. It determines what it represents. And that determination, once reached, becomes the final step before closure is formally recorded. By the time the final determination draft circulated through the highest review layer, the situation had already moved beyond the point of analysis. What remained was not discovery. It was confirmation. Across the street, the Black family no longer experienced the situation as something unfolding unpredictably in real time. The process had already become procedural in their understanding, something being interpreted at a structural level beyond visible interaction. And that understanding brought clarity rather than uncertainty. Inside the system, the consolidated behavioral profile had now reached its formal conclusion stage. Every report, every response, every documented absence of corroboration had already been incorporated into a unified behavioral sequence. And that sequence had been fully evaluated. The language in the final internal summary remained carefully structured, but its meaning was unmistakable. A sustained pattern of repeated reporting originating from a single source over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes consistently validating the repeated claims through independent verification. Once that structure is complete, systems no longer expand interpretation. They narrow it, because narrowing is what produces classification. The woman, still operating under the assumption that each of her actions existed as independent judgments of her environment, did not perceive the structural shift that had already taken place. To her, every call still represented a separate concern. Every response still felt like confirmation that she was being heard and taken seriously. But within the system processing those actions, separation no longer existed. All entries had already been unified into a single continuous behavioral record spanning time. And once continuity replaces separation, perception loses its independent influence on outcome. Across the street, the Black family remained steady, observing the final procedural transition without emotional escalation. What had once felt uncertain or reactive had now resolved into structured understanding of how institutional systems process accumulated behavioral data. There was no longer anticipation of sudden change, only recognition of finalization. Inside internal channels, the case had now entered its closure classification phase. All relevant data had been verified, cross-referenced, and aligned. The full behavioral sequence had been interpreted as a single structured pattern requiring formal categorization based on accumulated evidence over time. And that categorization step is always decisive. Because once behavior is fully defined at system level, it no longer exists as individual events in time. It exists as a complete structure with meaning assigned. The neighborhood itself remained outwardly unchanged, but internally, the meaning of everything within it had already shifted permanently. What once appeared as repeated complaints had become a fully documented behavioral sequence. What once seemed like routine responses had become part of a continuous interpretive framework. And what once felt like control through repetition had already transitioned into structured evaluation under formal review. Because once systems complete full behavioral consolidation, they no longer interpret isolated actions. They interpret what those actions collectively represent across time. And once that representation is fully defined, closure is no longer optional. It becomes procedural necessity. And procedural necessity always leads to one final step: formal acknowledgement of what the complete structure means within the system that processed it from the beginning. By the time the formal acknowledgement phase was initiated, the system was no longer working toward understanding, it was working toward closure of understanding. Everything required had already been processed. All that remained was documentation of conclusion. Across the street, the Black family no longer viewed the situation as something developing in real time. The emotional uncertainty that once surrounded the repeated incidents had long since dissolved into structured awareness of how the system itself was now interpreting the accumulated record. And that interpretation had stabilized. Inside internal channels, the consolidated behavioral profile had reached its final procedural state. The language of the summary remained precise and restrained, but its meaning was now fully defined within the system's logic framework. It described a sustained sequence of repeated reporting originating from a single source over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes that consistently supported or validated the repeated claims through independent verification. And once that structure is fully confirmed across all relevant entries, interpretation no longer evolves. It concludes. Because systems are not designed to maintain indefinite ambiguity once full behavioral continuity has been established. They are designed to resolve it. The woman, still operating under the assumption that each report existed independently of the others, did not perceive that her actions had already been restructured into a single continuous dataset within the system reviewing them. To her, each call remained an isolated expression of concern tied to immediate perception. But within the system, isolation no longer existed. Everything had been unified into one behavioral sequence spanning time. And once behavior becomes continuous rather than segmented, its interpretation shifts entirely. Across the street, the Black family now understood that the process had reached its final internal stage. There was no longer anticipation of escalation or uncertainty about direction. What remained was simply observation of procedural completion, how structured systems translate fully compiled behavioral data into formal classification. And that classification was now inevitable. Inside internal documentation, the case had entered final confirmation review. All entries had been aligned chronologically. All repeated patterns had been verified against response history. All inconsistencies had been contextualized within the broader dataset. And at that level of completion, systems no longer generate new interpretations. They finalize existing ones. Because once data integrity reaches full consolidation, the only remaining function is definition, not of individual actions, but of the structure those actions form collectively. The neighborhood itself remained visually unchanged, but its informational meaning had already been permanently redefined. What once appeared as isolated complaints had become a fully structured behavioral record. What once seemed like routine responses had become part of a continuous evaluative framework. And what once felt like control through repetition had already been fully reinterpreted as a documented pattern under formal system review. Because once structured systems complete behavioral consolidation, they no longer engage with separate moments in time. They engage with the complete sequence as a single entity. And once that entity is fully defined within the system, it cannot remain open-ended. It must be finalized. And finalization always leads to one outcome: formal acknowledgement of classification based on the complete behavioral structure that has already been established. By the time the final classification was prepared for archival status, the entire situation had already reached its last internal stage. Nothing about the record was incomplete. Nothing remained unverified. Every element of the behavioral timeline had already been processed, aligned, and interpreted within the system's structured framework. And once that happens, systems stop searching for meaning. They record it. Across the street, the Black family no longer experienced the situation as something unfolding in unpredictable waves. The uncertainty had long since been replaced by structured awareness of how institutional interpretation had shifted from reactive engagement to consolidated evaluation. And that shift had now fully completed its cycle. Inside internal documentation, the consolidated behavioral profile had reached final definition. The language remained procedural and neutral, but its meaning was no longer open to interpretation. It described a sustained sequence of repeated reporting originating from a single source over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes that consistently validated the repeated claims through independent verification. And when that structure is fully established and verified across time, systems no longer operate in analysis mode. They operate in conclusion mode. Because conclusion is what follows when data no longer produces alternative interpretations. The woman, still unaware of the full structural transformation that had taken place, continued to perceive each of her actions as separate and justified responses to immediate concerns. In her framework, each call still carried independent meaning. But within the system processing those actions, independence no longer existed. Everything had already been unified into a single continuous behavioral record spanning time. And once continuity replaces separation, interpretation becomes fixed rather than flexible. Across the street, the Black family understood that the process had now fully transitioned into its final procedural state. There was no longer anticipation of escalation or uncertainty about outcome. What remained was recognition that the system had completed its internal evaluation and was now preparing to formalize its conclusion. Inside internal channels, the case had entered final confirmation review. All data points had been aligned chronologically. All repeated patterns had been verified against response history. All inconsistencies had been contextualized within the broader behavioral framework. And at that point, systems do something definitive. They assign classification, not based on individual perception, But based on complete structural behavior over time, the neighborhood itself remained outwardly unchanged, but internally, its meaning had already been permanently rewritten. What once appeared as isolated complaints had become a fully integrated behavioral sequence. What once seemed like routine responses had become part of a continuous evaluative structure. And what once felt like control through repetition had already been fully redefined as a documented pattern under formal review. Because once systems complete full behavioral consolidation, they no longer interpret individual events as separate. They interpret what those events collectively demonstrate as a single structured reality. And once that reality is fully defined, closure is no longer something that happens. It is something that has already been completed within the system that processed it from the very beginning. By the time the system reached its final internal confirmation, everything that needed to be understood had already been understood. There were no missing links left in the record. No unresolved contradictions left to interpret. Only a fully formed behavioral sequence that had been examined across time, aligned across responses, and evaluated through consistent procedural logic. And once that point is reached, systems do not continue analyzing. They conclude. Across the street, the Black family no longer experienced the situation as a series of separate incidents or escalating events. It had long since transitioned into something else entirely in their understanding, something structured, documented, and fully visible in its pattern. What had once felt unpredictable had already settled into procedural clarity. Inside internal channels, the consolidated behavioral profile had been finalized into its definitive classification state. The language remained formal and restrained, but its meaning was absolute within the system's framework. A sustained sequence of repeated reporting originating from a single source over time, without corresponding escalation outcomes consistently validating the repeated claims through independent verification. And once that structure is fully confirmed, there is no further interpretation required. Only record. Because systems are not designed to leave complete behavioral patterns unresolved. They are designed to define them. The woman, still believing each of her actions existed independently, never saw the full structure that had formed around her behavior. To her, each call remained a separate decision based on perception in the moment. But within the system, separation no longer existed. Everything had already been unified into a single continuous timeline of behavior. And once behavior becomes continuous, it can no longer be interpreted in fragments. It must be understood as a whole. Across the street, the Black family remained calm as the final procedural phase completed itself quietly within the system. There was no confrontation, no dramatic moment of exposure, no sudden external shift, only the completion of structured interpretation. Because in systems built on records, the most important moments are not the loud ones. They are the ones where everything already aligns before anything is said out loud. And that alignment had now been reached. The neighborhood remained still, unchanged on the surface, but its meaning had already been permanently redefined by what had been documented over time. What once appeared as repeated complaints had become a fully recognized behavioral pattern. What once seemed like routine responses had become part of a complete evaluative structure. And what once felt like control through repetition had already been fully absorbed into a system that no longer interpreted actions individually but collectively. Because once systems complete full behavioral consolidation, they no longer ask what happened. They define what it means. And once meaning is defined at that level, there is nothing left to interpret. Only closure. And closure, once reached through structure, does not need to be announced. It simply exists, final, complete, and already recorded within the system that processed it from the beginning. With that said, thanks for watching and until next time. It was complete.